In the last lesson, we looked at how the CSS cascade works when there are multiple rules that conflict with each other. But in this lesson, we're going to focus more on how to combine different CSS selectors so that we can target a very specific element in our website in order to apply our style. From the previous coding exercise, you might have remembered that there is a part where we had a paragraph element that we wanted to be yellow and another paragraph element that we wanted to be white. When we apply the CSS style to target all of the P tags and we give it a particular color, then what's going to happen is everything that is a paragraph tag is going to be turned yellow. In our case, we changed this white text by giving this paragraph tag a specific class, which we set to white text. Now, you can imagine if you had lots of different things in your website and they all had different color requirements, you can't go around setting each one with a different class, right? That would be a lot of work and a lot of clutter in your HTML. So what can we do instead? Well, we can combine different selectors in order to select something specific. So in this case, notice that the paragraph that we want to set to color white happens to live inside a different div. And this div already has a different class. It has box, but it also has inner box. And in our case, we only wanted the text in the inner box right here to be turned into white. So we can use that piece of information and combine these two things in order to select a specific element. What this rule does is it first looks at the elements with this particular class, and then it looks at any of the descendants of that class. So anywhere inside that div, could be one level down, could be 3 levels deep. As long as it's enclosed inside the div, it counts as a descendant, and we're looking for a paragraph element. And once we've found that, then that is the one that's going to get a white color. And now when we run this code, you'll notice that even though we haven't added any new classes to this paragraph element, it has been specifically selected using this combine selector right here, turning the text white. There are different ways that we can combine CSS selectors, and I want to show you some of these different rules. The first one is the group rule, and this is done using a comma. You can have one selector here and then another selector, and to separate them, we've got this comma and a space. And what the grouping does is it selects both of the selectors, or even more, 2 or 3 different selectors, and applies the same style to the entire group. So everything that's selected. Now we're going to try and apply what we just learned, grouping selectors, in order to have the preview of our index.html look like this. We want both the H1 and H2 to have a color of blue-violet. Let's put this into practice by going to the current lesson, downloading the starting files as a zip file, extracting it, and opening it in VS Code. Once you've extracted the files, I want you to first go into the index.html file, and I want you to take a look at the structure of the starting file. It's really important for any of the upcoming challenges that you don't change any of the HTML code. So don't add any extra classes, don't add any IDs, basically don't touch this entire index.html file. Instead, you're going to be writing all of your code inside the style.css, and you're going to be using CSS, and more specifically the different combinations of CSS selectors, in order to carry out the challenge goals. As you might remember, the first goal that we're trying to achieve is to target both the H1 and the H2 and make sure that they both have a blue-violet text color. And we're going to group our selectors to achieve this. Pause the video and write your code inside the style.css to complete the challenge. All right, so remember to group a selector, we first write a selector, and then we add a comma, and then we add the second group of selectors. Now in this case, I'm using the element selector, but it could be that you're grouping different classes, you could be grouping different IDs. It doesn't really matter, as long as you're aware that you have two different selectors separated by a comma. Here we're going to change the color to a blue-violet color. And once I've done that, you can see we've got these two bits both with the same CSS applied to it. And this can be really handy when you're trying to save some time targeting different areas of your website. All right, let's look at some other different combiners. Now we can use the right angle bracket in order to select a child of another selector. So in this case, the first selector is the parent and the second selector is the child. What this means is that if we had a div where it opens here and it closes here, then inside here, a direct descendant, so just one level down, we might have a child. Let's say it's another div. Well, this then is the parent and this is the child. And the important thing is that this relationship is only one generation deep. In this case, when we want to select this particular div, then we can use this method by putting the parent, the right angle bracket, and then the child selector in order to select this particular element. And the most important thing to remember here is that it's a direct child. It's not a grandchild, not a great-grandchild. It has to be only one level nested inside. This selector has to be only one level inside this one. All right, let's try a practice run. Use this selector in order to change the index.html to set the first paragraph tag to a fire brick color. This is what you want your preview to look like. The next goal is to change the color of this paragraph element to a fire brick color. And in order to do this, we have to again study how we can select it specifically. Now notice here that it's got a class of done, but so do other things. It's got a paragraph element, but there are also other paragraph elements on screen. I want you to use what you've learned about the child selector in order to select this particular element and change its color. Pause the video now and give this a go. All right, so we mentioned that a child selector allows us to choose a parent and then specify something that is one level deep. So in this case, if this div was the parent, then you can see it has two child elements. One is this paragraph and another is the UL. Whereas these LIs, for example, they would not be children elements. They're actually grandchildren. Let's use what we learned in order to target this particular paragraph tag. In English, what our rule is going to specify is select the things that has a class of box and look at its children and find a paragraph element. This way, we distinguish this paragraph element from this one because it's not inside a div called box. It doesn't have a parent with that class. And also similar with this paragraph, it also doesn't have a parent that has a class of box. So let's go in here. Let's first select our parent using the selector for a class. And then using the right angle bracket, we're going to say, let's look for a direct descendant that is a paragraph element. And then let's set the color to a fire brick. You can see here, we've managed to set this particular paragraph's color to fire brick, but left these other paragraphs alone. The next combination we want to look at is the descendant combination. Here we've got two selectors. This is the ancestor and this is the descendant. So notice that here, all we've got is a single space between the two selectors. And what this means is that our descendant selector is going to apply the style to this descendant as long as it has an ancestor that matches this selector. So that means that you can have many, many levels deep. For example, you could have a class here, you could have a different class here, and then maybe you have a paragraph element in here. So then you can specify the left-hand selector to select on this particular class. And as long as somewhere within its enclosing brackets, there is a paragraph element, then this will be a valid descendant to select and apply your styles to. Let's try this out in code. What we want to do is we're going to try and select these 3 bullets here and give them a blue color. And we're going to use the descendant combination. In order to select these 3 here, if we look at the index.html, you can see that we've clearly got 3 list item elements. I don't want you to select on the list item. We're going to practice using the descendant selector instead. Make sure that you use the descendant combination in order to select these 3 items. And I want you to imagine that maybe there are other list item elements in the rest of the website. And we don't want to style them the same as what we've got here. So we're trying to turn the text blue just for these 3 bullet points, and we're not selecting on the list item element. We're instead using the descendant selectors. Pause the video and give that a go. All right, so as I mentioned previously, the easiest thing here would of course be simply to select all the LIs. But this is a very short website. Now imagine that your whole website is 2,000 lines long. There probably will be a lot other LI elements that you don't want to select on and apply this style. That's why we're going to use the descendant selector. Also, it's good practice for our learning. So in this case, notice that the LIs are a grandchild of this div. So we can simply select the box class and then use a space to say, let's find all the descendants that are LIs and change their color to blue. And that changes these 3 bullets. And notice because of this rule, it means that if I have any other LIs down here, then they don't get affected at all because my rule is very specific. And also notice how in this case, if I use the child selector, it's actually not going to work because the LI is 2 levels deep relative to this div that we're selecting. So we could select on the parent, which has the class list, but if we wanted to use the descendant selector, then we would have to use box as a class and then select all the LIs that are a descendant using this syntax. The next method I want to talk about is chaining selectors. And this looks really similar to the previous one where we had descendant selectors, so it's really important to pay attention here. When you chain a selector, effectively what you're doing is you're saying apply these styles to the instances where all the selectors are true. If we look at the way that we chain selectors, you can see we've got a selector and then we immediately add another selector. There is no space in between the 2 selectors whatsoever. So what this might look like is, let's say you had an H1, and this H1 also has some other attributes. Maybe it's got an ID of title. Maybe it's also got a class that's equal to big and heading. It's got 2 classes applied, 1 ID, and it's also an H1 element. If we had a whole bunch of other elements in our code, which also had the same ID or the same class, then we can use this chaining method to be really, really specific. That is the purpose of chaining. In order to get hold of this particular H1, we could say, we're looking for an H1, and then without any spaces, we add immediately, say, a £sign to select on the ID of title. Now the selector says, look for an H1 that also has an ID of title. And then we can even add on another one. So we could say it also has the class of big. and it also has the class of heading. Now we have a super specific selector where we've chained all of these selectors together to apply to just one single element. Now, there could be many H1s. There shouldn't be, but there could. There could be many elements with the same ID. Again, there shouldn't be, but it could happen. But more commonly, there probably will be many elements with the same class. But maybe there won't be an element with both of these classes. So remember, you chain selectors by having no space between the selectors, and your selector includes that symbol at the beginning. So it could be dot for classes. It could be the £sign for IDs. And it could have nothing in front where it's just the element. In the case of the element, if you're trying to chain this selector with anything else, this has to go first, because otherwise it can be really confusing. Let's say you had a class of big and you wanted to say, well, it also is an H1. Because there's no space when we chain, this might just look like a class called big H1, which is not what you want. Always start off with the element if you want to chain an element, and then you can add on the class using any sort of dot, or you could use the £sign to add any sort of ID. And remember, leave no spaces in between if you want to say that all of these selectors are in a single element. And this is to differentiate when you say want to use the descendant selector, where you say that I'm looking for something that has this particular class, but it also has a parent, which is an H1. This is when you're looking for the descendant combination. So now your challenge is to figure out how to only select these 2 bullet points in order to turn them into the sea green color that you see right here. These are the 2 items that we want to select. So we could go for the class, which is done, but notice that there's other items with the class done, and we can't change the HTML code. How can we use this chaining method in order to get hold of these 2 items? Well, notice what's very specific about this. These are list item elements that have this particular class. We can't select on all the list items, and we can't select on all the ones with a class of done, but we can chain these 2 selectors together using what we just learned. Pause the video and try to make these 2 bullets a color of sea green. All right, so we're going to chain these 2 selectors. We're going to look for all the list item elements that has the class done, to differentiate between paragraph elements that have a class of done and this list item element that doesn't have the class done, and make it really specific so we select just these 2 list item elements. So first we select the element, which is list item elements, and remember there's no space between the 2 selectors when we want to chain, and the second selector is the class selector of done. I'm going to change the color to sea green, like this. Now, remember that when we're chaining selectors, you can imagine that if we have first had the class selector and then we add the list item element, it thinks that we're looking for a class called done.li, which doesn't make any sense at all. Because our IDs and our class selectors have a special symbol, we always start off by selecting on the element, and then we add the other selectors. You can add it in order, it could be .done, and then you can add an ID, or you can select on the ID first and then the class. It doesn't really matter as long as the first item in the chain is your element. Now, the final thing I want to mention is we've looked at different ways of combining selectors, but remember that we can also combine these different combinations together. It gets a little bit more complex this way, but just in case you see it out in the world, I wanted to quickly explain this. So imagine if you wanted to select on something that has an ancestor that matches this selector, But then you use the chaining method in order to specifically select this item with these two selectors. Then you can combine all of this together and add that space in there and remove that space in there, or use the group, and you can combine lots of different combinations. Let's try this out and target this particular item right here and give it a font size of 0.5 rem so that it's much smaller than everything else on screen. And if you look at the code, it's a little bit tricky because this is a paragraph element that has a class of done, but there's also the same one up here, but we don't want to select this one. We just want this one, and we want to set its font size to 0.5 rem. So use what you learn and try out the different combinations in order to achieve that, to make this a tiny font size. Pause the video, give that a go. All right, what is different about this element and this element? Well, it's the fact that this one is inside a UL, whereas this one is inside a div. Normally inside a UL, you would see list item elements, but in this case, just for the example's sake, we've put in a paragraph element, which is totally valid as well, because you might have list elements that come up afterwards, and it could just be a line inside the unordered list. So now in order to select it, we're going to find a parent of UL that has a paragraph element that has a class of done. Let's do that here. So a UL as the ancestor, and then a paragraph element, and then a class of done, and we set the font size to 0.5 rem. And you can see that's achieved this. Now, the other way of doing this is, of course, using the child selector, which does the same thing right here, because it is an ancestor and it's also a parent in this case. So normally, unless you're sure that you only want the parent-child relationship, I prefer to use the descendant selector, because it's just a little bit more broad stroke, and normally you'll want to apply your style to multiple things that apply to that same rule. But both of these options are totally valid solutions, and I would consider you completely correct if you did either of them. The important thing for you to understand here is we've got an ancestor selector. We're using the space in order to say that this is the ancestor. This is not what we actually want to change the style to. But we're also using the chaining method to say this is quite specific and this is what we want to target. And notice that when you hover over these selectors, you actually see which element it's selecting as well, which can be really handy sometimes. Hopefully this has given you a little bit of insight into how different CSS selectors can be combined together in order to target specific things on screen. In the next lesson, we're going to look at the CSS position property so that we can learn more about how the positioning of items works in CSS. So for all of that and more, I'll see you there.